You can access the entire episode now on our website, forbiddenknowledge.news, Rokfin, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. And maybe dumb it down a little bit as much as I can. So what you're talking about basically is manipulation of a state of energy that we're not understanding yet, that basically binds everything together that we do understand in the material world. And it's a way of being able to manipulate this for plenty of different reasons, other than, like you said, it could be traveling linear distance, it could be time travel, it could be anti-gravity, it could be finding new forms of energy. It's basically everything that holds this reality together, right?
Yes, bang on, precisely. And if I may say very simply, it comes down to finding that interacting, whether with what we want to call the vacuum or the ether, or the quantum vacuum, whatever we want to call it, tends to be much more favorable in terms of, like, this underlying energy tends to be far more favorable when space and time begin to curve rather than being straight. So this speaks again to the spirals we've seen across ancient history, cave drawings, all of that. It also speaks to different angles of, for example, concaveness. Now, that is not, I want to say very clearly, that is not necessarily to say the Earth is flat per se. There's a bit more of, depth there, in my opinion. But I think there's certainly some type of, for lack of a better description, rendering going on based on some of my own private research. Some type of rendering in correspondence with a, dare I say, both a perhaps, I say this carefully, physical and also energetic type dome, if you will. And the question then becomes, well, this is where the game of perception tends to become very interesting with respects to, people send cameras up in the sky, and they, some of the cameras, they get flat images, other ones, they get curved ones. It becomes very interesting because you start to realize, for example, that you cannot experience anything outside of the particular local environment in which you are physically in. Sure, you could say that I've seen something on the TV or I'm watching a football game right now, but you as an individual are not there yourself at that very moment. So this speaks to the idea that there's this underlying energy that may have something to do with photons, in which there is a tether, if you will, that we are all connected to. And I use these words carefully, but this idea that there's an energetic tether of sorts, that we may be hooked up to some type of server, if you will.
So like you're saying, there's this base rendering of reality that has a basic understanding of what reality should look like, but depending on our observations and interactions, it could change, right? And
for lack of a better description, it reaches in via quantum processes in that sense, which would speak to fractality and what have you. But yes, yeah.
Man, that is incredible. Brandon, what are your thoughts on all this?
Sorry, if I may say one last thing. These photons, like a surfer riding a wave, they travel across what are called these null geodesics. So it gets very interesting when you realize that the geodesic, or the geometry of an area that you're trying to understand, by definition dictates the parameters and what's called the boundary conditions and all of the different, what are called affine principles that the energy could then do if you start to manipulate it. So what I mean, for example, is that if you have, say, for example, let's see here, say we have a cone, or like this is a reality that we are viewing in a 90-degree right angle sense, where this is here. What ends up happening is, if you want to start to perturb or manipulate via gravitational waves, let's say, the environment around you, there's always a proportionality constant that is underneath. It's sort of like this, which gives rise to information theory. There's always either a 1 and a 0 that is either creating or destroying, which could then be illustrated in a sinusoidal type wave. So what ends up happening is, if you want to expand this reality, say you want to mirror it or do what I've put over here for what I've drawn below, what ends up happening is that the dictation of the original coordinates and the original metric from over here dictates by definition what would be called a third time derivative, whether it's through velocity, acceleration, you name it, and that creates this here. But there's always a intersection point, sort of like the Penrose stairs, so to speak, or like a Mobius strip, ebbing and flowing. If you add a third time derivative or a fourth spatial dimension to the Mobius strip becomes very feasible, which then gives credence to what's called the Hopf bounce. And so what you then have is basically this reality that we started in here is directly and strictly proportional to what occurs here, because this is, we could say, I say this carefully, a mirror reflection or perturbation that has to follow the boundary conditions of this one here. So it would all be proportional, basically. And this is what arguably our intent may be formulating.
Yes, there's so many directions that we could possibly go.
Yeah.
Before I do, Brandon, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, so this is what it's been for 8 days, and it's been outstanding. This plus just all sorts of amazing stuff, and there's all sorts of things coming out soon for y'all to look forward to with him being here as well. And yeah, so this idea is one that I'd personally been vacillating on before he had even gotten here, and before we had, you never know with this, like, what are we going to talk about? Anti-gravity, whatever. Right. But it's really been this topic, and really sort of this assimilation of the tribes that we're in now, because the awareness of consciousness, this back to source, this greater understanding, this critical mass is, it seems, at play here in the models that we've been messing with. Because this idea goes is that, yes, this is a simulation of sorts. My best interpretation, and I'm only just going to tell you what I feel about this, is what I've been looking at for years and all that shit. Is just like, it is a simulation, but it's your choice to be here. You are fractaled into a bunch of little pieces. This is a ride for you to get to a critical mass, to figure out that it's a ride, and to see that it's just a game, and to also realize that you're in a dome. And once you realize that, it breaks open, and then the full technicolor of the actual reality and awareness and understanding and everything comes into this. Now, this ties into the Archon soul trap as far as not going towards the light when you die. This also comes to just even having conversations like this are the fuel for this awareness. So that's key to this. If anyone's curious about how to be actionable in this, have conversations like this. Think about this stuff. Expand your awareness of what's possible. And David, I definitely, and with Chris as well, are absolutely going to do that here today. So one of the big things that's with this was this idea for me with the Vitruvian Man. I started looking at that thing and thinking about it, and I was thinking about like the simulation, and I'm always, you know how we do, man. It's always up there, and it's always running around, and we're always enjoying it. And it got to a point where I was sitting there thinking about the mechanisms of the simulation, and when Nick Bostrom talks about this stuff, they always bring up the fact that it would take a planet-sized computer to run what we think a simulation would fool us in, right? But again, this is based on our perspective. I reminded back to like nuts and bolts crap whenever they're talking about these 90-degree right-hand turns that UFOs take, and they're like, well, we couldn't do that. And it's like, well, okay. And then they're like, well, why would they come here from a far-off place? Like, that would take too much time. It'd be too hard. And the answer is obviously it's not hard for them. Like, step out of your own idea of what's real and possible, and maybe there are answers there that would, shine some light onto the mechanisms here so we can move forward.
There's a difference between technology and science.
Yeah, man. And understanding and awareness and danger and threat. There are like all these like sub understandings with things that are just fascinating, and they're in the semantics, which again are so important to open up. So again, back to this idea of the simulation. I was sitting here thinking, well, perhaps like if you wanted to render an entire environment from our perspective, yes, it would look that way. But what if like it wasn't necessary? What if all you needed to do, just like in Rick and Morty, when he plays the game Roy, remember that? He puts on the helmet and he thinks he's this dude for like 40 years and gets cancer and goes back to the carpet store. Yeah. And he like wakes up, he's like, where's my wife? Where's my family? Because psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, sometimes people have this. So what I was thinking about with this is all you really need to do is create some sort of mechanism, algorithm, whatever, framework, quantum foam, anything like that, to apprehend 100% of the perspective of the occupant. That's all you need to do. And then I was thinking to that Vitruvian Man thing, and this kind of terrifies me, to be honest. If I'm being super honest with this, a little claustrophobic, is that maybe your reality ends right at the tips of your fingers as far as you can spread in any direction. And that's where your reality ends. Because then if this is just an apprehension of perception, you could stand at the edge of what you're thinking is the Grand Canyon and be so immersed in the fact that you perceive vastness. It doesn't need to be vast. You just perceive it that way.
It gives credence to what's something called Bohmian decoherence. So basically this idea that you are rendering with your environment. But when I say the word rendering very carefully.
Yeah.
But this idea that there's an organic sort of ebb and flow with your local environment as you begin to walk into a particular area or something like that. And what ends up happening is that environment makes subtle adjustments because it must correspond to what you intend and want. Although, if you are consciously not aware that that is the case, it becomes quite easy to realize that, to then start throwing around the word trap and what happens.